Hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our SAM Process Best Practice webinar. Today the webinar will be presented by Denise Bardwell from Byte Software Services, who's part of our SAM team. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Denise.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar. So thank you, Sarah, for the introduction as well. My name's Denise Bardwell, and I'm the Lead Process Maturity Consultant at Bytes. I've worked in IT for over 15 years now and started in an end-user community as a service desk analyst. Later, I worked in configuration management, and naturally that moved into looking at the software and managing the software installed upon it. And over the last 3 years, I've moved into consultancy, with my focus being on and around SAM processes. So today, we're going to identify some SAM processes and steps within those processes that can bring significant value in terms of cost avoidance, controls, and ultimately compliance. We will select a number of core SAM processes and highlight some typical problem areas for our customers and look at how these gaps can be remediated and therefore controlled. We will also think about some of the questions that you need to be asking yourselves to manage risk, and we will talk about your process journey and discuss how Bytes can help you create your business case for change and what your next steps are going to be as you embark upon your journey. So there is often a misconception that a tool alone will fix all of your SAM problems, but we have found from experience that this is not always the case. Processes underpin the success of your SAM program, but are often underestimated in terms of their complexity and importance. Customers starting SAM for the first time often are left feeling frustrated or confused and are simply not knowing where to start on their process journey. So purchasing a SAM tool and deploying a SAM tool is a step in the right direction, but you also need to think about processes that support it. So what we need to bear in mind is that software is a commodity with value attached to it, and our goal is to help you maximise the value of that asset throughout its life cycle by providing you with some real-life examples of process pain points for your consideration. So, if we think about the SAM tool, as I mentioned, purchasing and deploying a SAM tool solution is a step in the right direction, but you also need to ask some questions around the processes that you're going to use to make that more efficient for you. So the first one, how are you going to make sure you're reaching all parts of your network and infrastructure? How are you going to determine which software is actually authorised for use in your environment? Are any mechanisms in place to track the deployment of software to users? Who's going to conduct a license check to see if you have enough licenses when someone is actually asking for a piece of new software? And how are you going to go about obtaining and adding entitlement and any other data which constitutes proof of license? If we think about the media, the result of a purchase, how is this going to be added to the definitive media library and who's going to be responsible for it? Are there any guidelines in place to ensure users are aware of their obligation as consumers of software? And finally, reporting, how and when are you going to publish your reports illustrating your success stories? So these are just some of the questions you need to ask yourself when establishing your SAM processes. So this slide is here to illustrate that software spend and investment continue to remain an important part of IT budgets. In order to maximise and manage software as a commodity and get the most value from it, processes which support the life cycle of the asset are key to the success of your SAM program. So why can some SAM projects fail? So there are several factors that can cause your project to fail, and I've highlighted some of the key ones here. So the first one, lack of management commitment. By that we mean executive sponsorship and support from the top down to provide your organisation with traction and motivation for the project. The second point, budget. Investment in SAM is needed to get your project started and on track. So this is likely to initiate as a CapEx, and as you transition to BAU, it'll become more of an operational cost. The third point, organisational culture. So perhaps too much red tape or not enough can cause frustrations among your stakeholders. Also, initiating cultural change can bring its own challenges. So how are you going to deal with friction when faced with trying to change the people who have worked for years? Missing knowledge and/or resource. So as previously mentioned, getting to grips with SAM is no small feat, and sometimes there just isn't enough knowledge or staff internally to make a real difference. Technical shortcomings, so this could be in the form of tooling or knowledge and will require investment of some description, whether that's time, money or both. And finally, the scope and timeframes for the SAM programme are often underestimated. So SAM should really be seen as a continual and ongoing journey rather than an overnight success story. So the value of effective SAM processes. So as you're well aware, efficient processes generate a number of benefits to your organisation, and I've highlighted just some of them here. I'm not going to read them all out, but according to Gartner, the introduction of an effective SAM programme has the potential to reduce company IT costs by up to 30%, and this return on investment can occur within the first year. So with a fully operational SAM programme, you'll be able to control your costs and avoid unnecessary overspend. You will be informed about your existing IT environment and the software installed within it, and you can therefore start to plan and strategise your future IT investments. Above all, you're minimising your risk of being exposed to legal challenges in the form of perhaps audits, and your organisation can start moving towards addressing its compliance position. So at Bytes, we look at 10 core processes that support the life cycle of the asset, but these are by no means exhaustive, and we can offer a tailored approach to our customers based on your requirements. During this section of the webinar, we're actually just going to focus on 4 processes that we believe your organisation can gain real value from by reviewing. And these have been chosen because they're common themes that we come across with the majority of our customers, regardless of their size and geographics. So these are considerations which can help you add real value from a process and financial perspective. So the software request process, which is one of the early ones in the lifecycle chain. The first question there, how do you keep a track of users requesting software? That sounds relatively straightforward, but more often than not, we find that many of our customers fail to track server-based software requests or have very little involvement with projects. This can have a very large and real impact on your compliance position, with data center SAM being ever more complex. So simply adding more memory or changing a processor can actually affect your license position. The final point, license check. Do you conduct a license check? We find that many of our customers have the mechanisms in place to track user-based software requests, but some organisations still fail to carry out a license check prior to actually deploying the software and typically pass the request directly through to procurement. So they tend to purchase a license rather than risk a license not being bought at all. And this can obviously lead your organisation to becoming over-compliant and spending money it might not necessarily need to. If we think about the process, allocating an owner and initiating a license check in the workflow can lead to cost avoidance in that you may already have the ability to allocate a license that's already available in the license pools. So moving on to the inventory process, the first question, have you got records of all the assets you own within your organisation? So by this we mean hardware and software assets, but you should also think about your employees as assets, particularly for user-based licensing and CALs as well. And without the correct controls in place, inventory data will become unreliable, skew your estate picture, and ultimately your compliance position will be affected. Calculating your compliance position, given the complexities of software licensing and hardware nuances, is no easy task, particularly when we think about organisations shifting from traditional on-premise server to client models. So how are you going to deal with virtualisation, bring your own device, monitoring software across platforms and different technologies, and also recognising assets that are in the cloud or on a hosted infrastructure. So having strong controls over the hardware and software assets you own is therefore essential. But many of our customers do not feel confident with the accuracy over their hardware estate, with actual numbers being near impossible to obtain for some. And I'm sure that many of our listeners feel that way today. So from a process perspective, if you ensure that assets have got a discovery or inventory agent deployed to them as part of the core build, this could be a consideration, but if this is not possible, another means of capturing the information needs to be in place, such as manual inventory. We'd also recommend periodic cross-referencing with other data sources, such as Active Directory, to validate the accuracy of your hardware estate. So this should be a constant and continual check and validation there. As I said, accurate inventory data really is one of the keys to the success of your SAM program. So moving on to the procurement process, centralised procurement functions will obviously provide your organisation with greater control over what software is being purchased by whom and for what reasons. But we appreciate that this cannot always happen, particularly with larger scale organisations. One of the biggest problems within this process is that software or entitlement or both, media, actually ends up with the person who requested it, and this might be an end user. But the question is this right, or are we exposing ourselves to additional risk? So we'd recommend that software goods are received by an IT team, such as your SAM team, but if this isn't possible, a mechanism needs to be in place which will allow the requester to be contacted to confirm what the entitlement was that they received, and also what happened to the media as a result of that purchase. The IT team can then validate that what was received actually matches what was ordered, add the entitlement to the SAM tool, or if you haven't got one, a manual equivalent, and update the definitive media library or equivalent network system. If we think about users with corporate credit cards as well, who have the ability to purchase software and hardware, these people should be discouraged as much as possible to maintain a streamlined environment. But if we consider for a moment the requirement for users in the field, for example journalists, they may have a genuine and immediate need to purchase a new device in the event of failure. But how do you ensure that they are authorised to do so? And how do you manage the resultant procedure, such as registering the new asset and disposing of the old? So question, does your organisation have the process steps in place to facilitate these kind of controls? Moving on to the retirement process, so activities that take place within your retirement process have a real impact on the integrity of the other processes that touch it, such as inventory management and the resultant harvesting and ultimately compliance process. So in order to support the inventory process and maintain an accurate picture of assets owned, it really is advisable to delete the assets at source from your tools as part of your decommission process. This will in turn feed your harvesting process, and licenses and software will be returned to the pool for reuse. If you have a SAM tool, the data feeding it is accurate and current, and there will be little or no intervention required by the SAM team, and also no reliability on the drop-off or inactivity rules that are often set to a 3-month period. Movers and leavers, as well as joiners, represent one of the biggest shifts in IT deltas that also need to be managed. So as mentioned earlier, if you think about your end users as entities with hardware and software allocated to them, managing the estate and ultimately your compliance position becomes a lot more consolidated. If you don't intend to renew your existing agreement, for example, perhaps due to a technology change, do you understand the exit terms of your agreement? What process steps do you need to go through to ensure that you are not unintentionally breaching those conditions? And finally, your disposal process, if it's managed by a third party, are they issuing you with destruction certificates, and do they conform to certain regulatory requirements? So building a business case for change. So your business case or SAM plan really does act as a guide to some of the steps that you need to consider as you move from initiation to implementation and finally transition to business as usual. So Bytes can offer you support with this, your project, and we use a model that's aligned to the one outlined here as well. So if we look at the first column, define, there's going to be an investment of time and money when initiating your SAM program. So planning, allocating budget, and ensuring you have executive sponsorship are some of the first steps. You need to determine who your stakeholders are and ensure that their roles and responsibilities are known and understood. Also understand your reporting criteria, so what you want to report on and how often, and the mechanism you're going to use to do so. Moving on to design, SAM consists collectively of policies, processes and procedures. So if you think about the life cycle of your software assets and look at your existing policies, processes and procedures to support this, and also your tools, are they adequate enough? And this would be where we'd make some changes, propose some change in the design phase. So deliver. So process and policy change as well as implementation is no small task. So we'd recommend that you scope your activities and plan your activities in line with your objectives and milestones, and ensure a mechanism is in place to track the progress against these as well. And also software use guidelines, they form an essential part of your SAM plan to ensure you have buy-in and commitment from everyone in your organisation, and communicating this to your end users in an effective way also needs to be considered. And finally, manage. So being able to chart your progress and demonstrate your success is an important BAU activity. So conduct periodic assessments to see your improvements. So moving on to some other process considerations as you embark upon your journey. Inventory. So know the hardware assets you own and are therefore legally obliged to license. Collate your contracts and ensure their validity, and do the same with your entitlement and any other supporting documentation. Learn. With complex license models, increase your license knowledge by working with our experts or doing your own research. And review, understand where your gaps are today and what you need to do to fill them. So I hope that throughout this webinar we've provided you with some food for thought as you embark upon your journey. So this slide really is here to reiterate the kind of advantages that can be realised with robust processes. I won't read them all out for you, but this is no doubt a big project, but done well, with the right investment, support, obviously processes and controls, you'll be able to take your software investment and realise a real return from it. Thank you everybody for your time on the webinar today, and I look forward to receiving any questions that you may have.